Ethan remained motionless inside the Mercedes while rain slid slowly down the windshield in silver streaks, blurring the glowing diner sign into something ghost-like and distant. Inside the kitchen, Clara continued scrubbing dishes beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, as if this exhausting midnight routine had become normal to her. The realization settled heavily into Ethan's chest because this was not a one-time emergency. The speed of her hands, the worn apron hanging loosely from her shoulders, even the way the staff ignored her presence, all told the same story. She had been doing this for a long time. A truck rumbled through the parking lot, snapping Ethan briefly from his thoughts. He looked down at his watch. 3:18 in the morning. His wife should have been asleep in silk sheets 30 stories above the city skyline, not standing ankle-deep in greasy water beside strangers who barely looked at her. Through the steamed glass, Ethan watched Clara pause for just a second to stretch her sore fingers. Her face tightened faintly before she forced herself back to work. The movement was small, almost invisible, but Ethan noticed it immediately because Clara had always hidden pain that way, quietly, without asking for help. His mind drifted backward through the last several months with painful clarity now that the pieces finally connected. Clara insisting she was fine whenever he asked why she looked tired. Clara skipping expensive dinners because she was not hungry. Clara falling asleep in the passenger seat almost every night. He remembered waking up at 2 in the morning several weeks earlier and finding her side of the bed cold. When he texted asking where she was, she simply replied, "Could not sleep. Went for a drive." Ethan had accepted the answer without another question because he had been preparing for a board meeting worth nearly $400 million. The memory made him sick now. Inside the diner kitchen, a younger waitress walked past Clara carrying dirty coffee mugs. "Need these done fast," she muttered impatiently before disappearing again through the swinging doors. Clara nodded softly. "I know." Her voice was barely audible even through the glass. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. This was the same woman who once spent weekends volunteering at children's hospitals beside him while newspapers called them America's golden couple. The same woman who remembered every employee birthday inside his company while he forgot half of them himself. Clara had never cared about luxury. Ethan knew that from the beginning. While other people admired his penthouse, Clara still loved small diners with cracked leather booths and old jukeboxes. She still wore sweaters from 10 years ago because she claimed they were comfortable. Ethan used to find that beautiful. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped noticing it altogether. A loud burst of laughter suddenly echoed from inside the kitchen. One of the cooks, a heavy-set man in his 20s, pointed toward Clara's sneakers. "Those things are falling apart," he joked while shaking his head. "You need a raise, Clara." Another worker chuckled while wiping down the counter. Clara gave a small smile that never reached her eyes. Maybe someday. Ethan felt his stomach twist violently. His wife owned more wealth than entire neighborhoods, yet she was standing there pretending worn-out sneakers were all she could afford. The humiliation of it hollowed him out from the inside. Then something else caught his attention. Clara pulled a small folded paper from her apron pocket and glanced at it quickly before hiding it again. But Ethan recognized the blue hospital logo immediately. Northwestern Memorial. His heartbeat slowed. A terrible feeling crept over him as memories surfaced of Clara mentioning her younger brother, Mason, months earlier. Mason had always struggled financially after losing his construction job due to chronic health problems. Ethan remembered offering help once during a family dinner, but Clara gently changed the subject so quickly that he assumed the situation had improved. Now, watching her exhausted body sway slightly from fatigue under those fluorescent lights, Ethan understood the truth. Clara had never wanted his money. She had wanted his attention. And somehow, despite all his power, all his intelligence, all his billion-dollar success, he had failed to notice the woman he loved quietly drowning right beside him. The rain outside grew heavier. Inside the diner, only the sound of running water remained. Ethan finally stepped out of the car, and the freezing rain instantly soaked the shoulders of his dark wool coat as he crossed the empty parking lot toward the diner. The smell of coffee, grease, and industrial soap hit him the moment he opened the front door. A bell chimed softly overhead, but none of the exhausted customers looked up for more than a second. To them, he was just another late-night stranger escaping the storm. Ethan moved slowly toward the counter, his polished shoes strangely loud against the worn black and white tile floor. The waitress refilling coffee mugs barely glanced at him. Kitchen closes in 20 minutes, she muttered automatically. Ethan nodded faintly, but his eyes never left the swinging doors leading to the back. Through the narrow glass panel, he could still see Clara standing at the industrial sink beneath the fluorescent lights. Steam drifted around her like fog, while stacks of plates towered beside her shoulders. She looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way Ethan had never allowed himself to notice before. A cook pushed through the kitchen doors carrying a tray of leftovers. "You still awake back there, Clara?" he joked. "Do not fall asleep standing up again." A few workers laughed quietly. Clara forced a tired smile. "I am awake." But even from several feet away, Ethan could hear the exhaustion in her voice. The sound hollowed him out. He slid silently into an empty booth near the kitchen entrance, hidden enough that Clara could not immediately see him. For the first time in years, Ethan was not thinking about stock prices, acquisitions, or investor calls. He was remembering tiny moments he had ignored. Clara rubbing her wrists while cooking dinner. Clara quietly canceling a weekend trip because she said she had errands. Clara falling asleep at the dining table with unpaid medical paperwork half hidden beneath a magazine. The signs had been everywhere. Ethan had simply stopped looking. Across the diner, an old country song hummed softly from a dusty speaker while rain battered the windows harder now. The atmosphere felt heavy and tired, like a place where people came when life became too expensive to pause. Ethan noticed Clara move carefully toward a shelf above the sink. She reached for another stack of plates, but her hand trembled slightly from fatigue. One plate slipped. It crashed loudly onto the floor, shattering into white pieces across the tile. The entire kitchen went silent. Clara immediately bent down. "I am sorry," she whispered quickly. "I will clean it up." A man in a stained manager's shirt stormed out from the office nearby, irritation already written across his face. "Seriously?" he snapped. "That is the third thing this week." Clara kept her eyes lowered while kneeling beside the broken pieces. "I will pay for it." With what? She was accepting humiliation like someone who believed she deserved it. The manager sighed dramatically and shook his head. "Just clean it up and finish the floor before you leave. We open again at 6. Clara nodded softly. "Okay." The man walked away muttering under his breath while the kitchen returned to its exhausted rhythm. But Ethan remained frozen in the booth. He had spent years building a reputation as one of the most powerful negotiators in corporate America. Men twice his age feared disappointing him. Entire companies changed direction when he entered a room. Yet the woman who shared his bed was apologizing to strangers for being too tired to hold a plate steady at 3 in the morning. The contrast shattered something inside him. Then Ethan noticed the older dishwasher standing beside Clara lean closer and speak quietly. "You should go home, sweetheart," the woman whispered kindly. "You look pale." Clara offered a faint smile while continuing to mop the floor. "I still need Friday's overtime." "That hospital bill again?" the woman asked gently. Clara paused for half a second before nodding once. Mason's treatment got more expensive. Ethan stopped breathing. The room around him suddenly felt distant and muffled, as though the world itself had gone quiet. His wife had been working herself into exhaustion to pay medical bills while he sat in glass towers discussing billion-dollar expansions. And the worst part was not the secrecy. It was understanding exactly why she hid it from him. Somewhere along the way, Clara had learned that asking her husband for emotional support no longer felt safe. Clock above the diner counter flickered softly to 3:37 in the morning while Ethan sat motionless in the corner booth, unable to look away from Clara. Every exhausted movement she made felt like another quiet accusation against the man he had become. She moved slower now, carefully wiping down metal counters while fighting the heaviness in her eyes. The fluorescent lights above her cast pale shadows across her face, making the exhaustion impossible to hide anymore. Ethan remembered the first time he met Clara 12 years earlier in a crowded bookstore cafe near the University of Illinois campus. She had been sitting alone beside the window reading a worn paperback novel while snow fell outside. No designer clothes, no expensive jewelry, just a quiet woman with soft eyes who smiled like she actually saw people. Back then, Ethan had nothing except ambition and student debt. Clara stayed beside him through every failure before success finally arrived. She worked extra hours at a daycare while he built software programs from a tiny apartment kitchen. She celebrated every small victory like it mattered. And when investors finally turned him into a millionaire almost overnight, Clara never changed. Ethan did. At first, the changes were subtle. Longer work hours, delayed vacations, missed dinners. Then came the interviews, private flights, charity galas, and endless pressure of staying successful in a world where people disappeared the second they slowed down. Ethan convinced himself he was sacrificing time now, so Clara could have security forever later. But later kept moving farther away. Inside the diner kitchen, Clara leaned briefly against the counter as if steadying herself. The older dishwasher beside her frowned with concern. "You need to sit down for a minute," she whispered. Clara shook her head gently. "I cannot. I still have deliveries to sort before morning." "Honey, you are going to make yourself sick." Clara forced another tiny smile. "I will be okay." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment because those exact same words echoed painfully in his memory now. He had heard Clara say them dozens of times over the past year. Whenever he asked if she was tired, whenever she canceled plans, whenever he noticed the dark circles beneath her eyes. He never pushed further because some part of him believed love would patiently wait until he finally had time again. But love had not been waiting. It had been quietly carrying weight alone. The waitress passed Ethan's booth holding a coffee pot. "Need a refill?" she asked softly. Ethan barely looked up. "No, thank you." She studied him briefly before lowering her voice. "You know Clara?" Ethan hesitated for half a second. "She is my wife." The waitress blinked in visible surprise and glanced toward the kitchen window. "Your wife?" Ethan nodded once. The woman looked back toward Clara again with a strange sadness crossing her face. "She never talks much about home," she admitted quietly. "Just says she needs the shifts." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "How long has she worked here?" "About 8 months." The answer hit him harder than he expected. 8 months. Nearly 240 nights while he attended conferences, negotiated contracts, and slept in empty hotel suites believing his marriage was simply going through a quiet phase. Months of Clara secretly driving across the city after pretending to go to sleep beside him. 8 months of hiding pain so carefully that even her own husband failed to see it. The waitress continued speaking softly while wiping the table beside him. "She is the nicest person here. Never complains. Covers shifts when people call out. Half the staff treats her badly because they think she is desperate." Ethan slowly looked toward the kitchen again. "And she just accepts it?" The waitress shrugged sadly. "People get used to carrying too much." The words lingered heavily between them. Across the diner, Clara carefully lifted another heavy tub of dishes, but her arms trembled slightly under the weight. Ethan instinctively started to stand before catching himself. He suddenly understood something deeply humiliating. Clara had spent years protecting his peace while silently destroying her own. Not because she was weak, not because she lacked options, but because somewhere inside her heart, she still loved the exhausted young man from that bookstore cafe more than the billionaire sitting in this diner tonight. Ethan no longer knew if that man still existed. Then Clara paused suddenly beside the sink and pressed her hand quietly against her lower back as pain flashed across her tired face. It lasted only a second before she forced herself upright again. But for Ethan, it felt like watching a crack spread through glass in slow motion. The room around him faded into silence. Because at that moment, for the first time in many years, the billionaire understood something money could never repair quickly. Exhaustion inside the body eventually heals. Exhaustion inside the heart does not. By 4:10 in the morning, the diner had grown quieter, but the heaviness inside Ethan's chest only deepened with every passing minute. Outside, the rain finally slowed into a cold mist that blurred the parking lot lights into pale halos. Inside Harper's Grill, exhausted workers moved through the final stretch of the night shift with the dull silence of people too tired to speak much anymore. Clara remained at the center of it all, wiping tables one by one while fighting to stay upright. Ethan noticed the slight limp in her step now. He wondered how many nights she had driven home exhausted while he slept peacefully beside an empty stretch of sheets without ever realizing she had not been there. The thought made him feel ashamed in a way no public scandal or business failure ever had. Near the counter, 2 truck drivers paid their checks while one of the younger cooks disappeared into the back room laughing at something on his phone. The older dishwasher quietly handed Clara a foam cup of coffee. "Drink something before you pass out," she said gently. Clara accepted it with both hands like someone grateful for even the smallest kindness. Thank you, Marlene. Ethan watched Clara take a careful sip before staring absently at the steam rising from the cup. Her eyes looked distant now, almost hollow with exhaustion. Then she quietly reached into her apron pocket again and unfolded the hospital paper Ethan had noticed earlier. This time, she studied it longer. Even from across the diner, Ethan could see the overdue balance stamped across the page. Clara closed her eyes briefly before folding it back up with trembling fingers. Ethan's throat tightened painfully. His company had recently spent $8 million redesigning executive offices in New York because investors thought the old ones looked outdated. Meanwhile, Clara was counting overtime shifts to keep her brother alive. The imbalance of it sickened him. Ethan lowered his gaze toward the untouched glass of water in front of him. For years, he had told himself he was building security for the people he loved. But sitting inside that tired little diner at 4 a.m, he finally understood the difference between providing luxury and providing presence. Clara had never needed private jets or penthouses. She needed someone who noticed when she was quietly falling apart. The swinging kitchen doors opened again as the manager returned holding a clipboard. Clara, before you leave, inventory still needs to be counted. Clara blinked slowly. Tonight, the manager sighed impatiently. Unless you know another magical time to do it. Clara nodded immediately despite the exhaustion written across her face. I will finish it. Ethan's jaw tightened. The manager turned away without another glance, already scrolling through his phone. Not once had the man noticed Clara struggling to stay standing. Not once had he asked if she was okay. And yet Ethan realized with painful honesty that he had done the exact same thing for months. Different world, different clothes, same blindness. A deep silence settled over him. Then suddenly Clara swayed slightly beside the counter. The foam cup slipped from her hand and spilled coffee across the floor. Ethan instinctively rose halfway from the booth before Clara quickly steadied herself against the counter. I am okay, she whispered immediately, embarrassed by the attention. Marlene stepped closer with concern. Sweetheart, you are burning yourself out. Clara forced a weak smile. Just tired. But Ethan saw the truth in her eyes. This was no longer ordinary exhaustion. This was someone running on pure love and obligation long after her body had started giving up. Marlene lowered her voice carefully. Does your husband know you are doing all this? Clara became very still. For several seconds, only the hum of the refrigerators filled the silence. Then Clara looked down at the spilled coffee near her shoes and answered softly. He already carries enough. The realization cracked something deep inside him. Because suddenly Ethan understood the cruelest part of all this. Clara had not hidden her suffering because she did not trust him with money. She hid it because she no longer trusted him with vulnerability. Somewhere between board meetings and business deals, he had become a man who solved problems with wire transfers instead of listening. And the woman who once told him everything had slowly learned to survive without needing him emotionally at all. Ethan sat back down heavily in the booth while Clara quietly grabbed a mop to clean the spilled coffee herself. No one in the diner recognized the billionaire sitting among them. But at that moment, Ethan Cole had never felt smaller in his entire life. The old country music had stopped playing hours ago. Now the only sounds came from the hum of refrigerators, the clatter of dishes, and the soft scrape of Clara's mop moving slowly across the floor. Ethan remained in the booth near the kitchen entrance, unable to leave. Unable to interrupt, almost afraid to break the fragile reality unfolding in front of him. Because every minute he stayed there revealed another painful truth about the woman he thought he knew better than anyone else. Clara finished mopping near the counter before quietly carrying a heavy bucket toward the back sink. Her shoulders sagged from fatigue now, and Ethan noticed how carefully she moved, conserving energy with every step like someone running on almost nothing. The older dishwasher, Marlene, watched her with obvious worry. You need to eat something, she said softly. Clara shook her head without looking up. I am okay. That is what you always say. Clara gave a tired smile while emptying the bucket. Because it is easier. The words hung in the air for several seconds. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately because he understood exactly what she meant. Easier to say she was okay. Easier to hide pain than explain it to someone too distracted to notice. Easier to carry everything silently than risk becoming another obligation in a husband's already crowded life. Across the kitchen, the young cook who had mocked Clara earlier tossed his apron onto the counter. I am out, he announced before grabbing his backpack. He glanced briefly toward Clara. You staying until sunrise again? Clara nodded faintly. Inventory still needs to be done. The young man laughed softly. You seriously need a different life. He disappeared through the back door before Clara could answer. Ethan stared at the empty doorway after him because the careless comment cut deeper than the cook would ever understand. Clara did need a different life. Not a richer one. A gentler one. A life where love did not require exhaustion to prove itself. Ethan slowly removed his wedding ring and turned it between his fingers beneath the table. He remembered placing that ring on Clara's hand 12 years earlier beneath soft summer lights in a tiny lakeside chapel outside Milwaukee. Then, he promised her one thing more than anything else. No matter what happens, I will never let you carry life alone. Ethan noticed how pale she looked beneath the fluorescent lights. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes he had somehow missed at home for months. Marlene handed her half a sandwich wrapped in paper. Eat. Clara hesitated. I should finish inventory first. Clara. The older woman's voice softened with firm kindness. Nobody here is going to die if ketchup packets get counted 10 minutes later. For the first time that entire night, Clara let out a small, tired laugh. It was quiet and brief, but hearing it shattered Ethan in a completely different way. Because he realized strangers inside this little diner had become more emotionally present in Clara's daily life than her own husband. Marlene sat beside her while Clara slowly ate a few bites. How is your brother doing? She asked gently. Clara swallowed carefully before answering. The dialysis is helping some. And the surgery? Clara looked down at the sandwich in her hands. Still too expensive. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He had spent more money on one corporate dinner last month than Clara needed to save her brother's future. Yet she had never asked him for a single dollar. Not once. The silence inside the diner suddenly felt unbearable. Ethan looked toward Clara again, just as she quietly removed her wedding ring and rubbed the pale mark beneath it, almost absently, as though the skin there hurt after wearing it too long. Then she whispered something so soft Ethan almost did not hear it. I miss him sometimes. Marlene looked confused. Your husband? Clara nodded once without lifting her eyes. The old version of him. Ethan stopped breathing entirely. The room around him faded into a distant blur while those 6 words echoed through him with devastating clarity. Because Clara had not fallen out of love with him. She had been grieving him while he was still standing right beside her. The diner clock crept toward 5:20 in the morning as the first pale traces of dawn began pressing weakly against the rain-streaked windows. Outside, Chicago remained cold and gray, the streets nearly empty except for delivery trucks and tired commuters beginning another long day. Inside Harper's Grill, exhaustion clung to the air like steam. Clara sat quietly at the back counter with a clipboard beside stacks of supply boxes, counting inventory with slow, careful focus while fighting the heaviness in her eyes. Ethan remained hidden in the corner booth, but something inside him had already changed completely. The powerful businessman who walked into this diner an hour earlier no longer mattered. Only the husband remained now, and the husband was devastated. Clara brushed loose strands of blonde hair behind her ear while writing numbers carefully onto the inventory sheet. Her handwriting looked shakier than usual from fatigue. Every few minutes she paused to rub her wrists or blink away exhaustion, but she never complained once. Ethan watched her quietly and remembered another late night many years ago when they were both 20-something and struggling to survive. Back then, Ethan stayed awake for 36 straight hours building software before a major investor presentation. Clara had sat beside him on the apartment floor the entire night, eating vending machine snacks and proofreading lines of computer code she barely understood, just so he would not feel alone. At sunrise, Ethan collapsed onto the couch from exhaustion, and Clara covered him gently with a blanket before going to work herself. She never asked for credit, never demanded recognition. Clara loved quietly. That was what made this so painful now. She had always carried burdens silently until they became too heavy to hide. Ethan suddenly understood that her secret job was not the beginning of the problem. It was the final stage of loneliness after months of emotional distance. Near the kitchen entrance, the manager appeared again while adjusting his stained tie. Inventory done yet? He asked sharply. Clara looked up immediately. Almost. He sighed dramatically while checking his watch. Morning crew gets here in 30 minutes. Try not to move so slow. Ethan's hands tightened beneath the table. The manager walked away without noticing Clara quietly inhale through pain before returning to the clipboard. Marlene shook her head disapprovingly once he disappeared. Ignore him. Clara gave a faint smile. He is stressed. Ethan nearly broke hearing that. Even now, Clara still defended people who treated her poorly, the same way she defended Ethan to herself every day while quietly grieving the man he used to be. A deep silence settled inside him. Then Clara suddenly looked toward the diner windows for the first time that night. Her tired eyes drifted across the empty booths until they landed directly on Ethan. Everything stopped. For one frozen heartbeat, neither of them moved. Clara stared at him in complete disbelief while the color slowly drained from her exhausted face. Ethan stood immediately from the booth, but Clara remained motionless beside the counter as though her mind could not fully process what she was seeing. The board slipped slightly from her hands. "Ethan," she whispered. Her voice sounded fragile, almost afraid. Ethan took a slow step toward her, but Clara instinctively looked down at herself first. At the stained apron, the damp sneakers, the soap marks on her sleeves. A wave of embarrassment crossed her face so quickly it nearly destroyed him. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. Because standing there beneath those fluorescent lights, Clara no longer looked like the confident woman from charity galas or magazine photos beside him. She looked exhausted, human, worn down by carrying too much alone for too long. And somehow, seeing her like this made Ethan love her more painfully than ever. Marlene quietly stepped away, sensing the moment did not belong to anyone else anymore. The hum of refrigerators filled the silence while Clara lowered her eyes again, clearly ashamed he had seen this hidden part of her life. That hurt Ethan most of all. Not the secret job, not the lies, the shame. Clara had been suffering alone while trying to protect his image of her at the same time. Ethan finally reached her side slowly. Up close, he could see tiny cuts along her dry hands from hours in hot water and industrial soap. He looked at those trembling fingers and remembered how they once held his face when he was nobody. "Clara," he said quietly, his voice breaking for the first time in years. She immediately shook her head a little, almost apologetically. "I was going to tell you eventually." Ethan stared at her through burning eyes. Because in that heartbreaking moment, the billionaire realized something unbearable. The woman standing in front of him had spent months terrified of becoming a burden to the man who once promised she would never carry life alone. Clara stood frozen beside the counter while the fluorescent lights hummed softly above them, her exhausted eyes fixed on Ethan as though she still could not believe he was really there. The pale morning light beginning to creep through the diner windows only made her look more fragile now. Her apron was damp from hours of work, loose strands of blonde hair clung to her cheeks, and her hands trembled slightly around the clipboard she still held against her chest like protection. Ethan had stood before presidents, billionaires, and entire rooms of investors without fear once in his life. Yet nothing had ever felt harder than looking into Clara's tired eyes at that moment. "How long?" he asked quietly. Clara lowered her gaze immediately. "It does not matter." "Clara." His voice cracked again. "Please." A painful silence settled between them. Finally, she answered softly without looking up. "Since February." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Nearly 8 months. 8 months of hidden exhaustion. Months of late-night lies that were never truly lies at all, just quiet survival." Clara shifted uncomfortably beneath his stare. "I did not want you to find out like this." Ethan looked around the diner kitchen slowly. The stained floors, the flickering lights, the heavy smell of grease and industrial soap still lingering in the air. Then he looked back at the woman he loved standing in the middle of it all wearing worn sneakers and a tired expression she had hidden from him for far too long. "Why did you not tell me Mason needed help?" Clara swallowed hard. "Because you were already carrying so much." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "I am your husband." A faint sadness crossed Clara's face then. Not anger, not resentment, just sadness worn thin by time. "You are everyone's husband lately, Ethan." The words landed gently, but they cut deeper than cruelty ever could have. The room fell completely silent except for the soft buzzing of the refrigerators nearby. Ethan looked down because he knew she was right. Somewhere between building companies and maintaining an empire, he had become emotionally unavailable to the one person who never asked him for anything except presence. Clara's fingers tightened slightly around the clipboard. I kept trying to find the right moment to tell you, she admitted quietly. But every time I saw you, you looked exhausted or distracted or halfway out the door already. Ethan felt shame rise hot in his chest. Clara continued softly, almost apologetically. Then Mason's treatments got worse, and the bills kept growing, and I just... Her voice weakened. I did not want to become another problem you had to solve. Ethan looked at her as though his heart had stopped beating entirely. Because that sentence revealed the deepest fracture between them. Clara no longer believed she could come to him with pain without feeling like an obligation. The billionaire who could fix almost any problem in the world had somehow made his own wife feel emotionally alone. Marlene quietly moved past them carrying a bucket toward the back room, deliberately giving them privacy. Even the manager remained silent now after noticing the strange tension between the exhausted woman and the sharply dressed man standing beside her. Ethan stepped closer slowly. "Look at me," he whispered. Clara hesitated before finally lifting her eyes. They were filled with exhaustion and embarrassment and something even more heartbreaking. Distance. Ethan gently reached for her hands. The moment his fingers touched her skin, he felt the roughness from endless hours in hot water and chemicals. Tiny cuts lined her knuckles. Her hands used to smell like vanilla lotion and coffee in the mornings. Now they smelled faintly of bleach. Ethan's composure shattered quietly. He bowed his head over her trembling hands while emotion finally broke through years of controlled restraint. Clara immediately looked alarmed. "Ethan," but he shook his head slowly, unable to speak for several seconds. When he finally did, his voice sounded almost unrecognizable. "I thought I was building a better life for you." Clara's expression softened painfully. "I never needed a better life." Tears burned in Ethan's eyes as the full truth finally settled inside him. Clara had never cared about wealth. The penthouse, the private jets, the luxury vacations. None of it mattered to her if she had to lose the man she loved to obtain it. She only wanted the version of Ethan who once stayed awake beside her talking about dreams in tiny apartments at midnight. The version who noticed when she was tired. The version who listened. Clara looked away, ashamed of the tears forming in her own eyes now. "I did not want you seeing me like this." Ethan tightened his grip gently around her worn hands. "This is the first real thing I have seen in a long time." The fluorescent lights flickered softly overhead while dawn slowly brightened the windows behind them. And standing in the middle of that exhausted little diner, the billionaire finally understood that the most dangerous kind of poverty is not financial. It is emotional neglect inside a marriage that once felt like home. Dawn finally broke across Chicago in pale shades of silver and blue as the rain outside slowed to a cold mist drifting through the empty streets. Inside Harper's Grill, the fluorescent lights suddenly felt softer somehow, less harsh than before, as though even the tired little diner understood something important had changed between the two people standing quietly beside the counter. Clara remained still while Ethan held her worn hands gently in his own, neither of them speaking for several moments because some truths arrived too deeply for immediate words. The morning crew had begun filtering quietly into the kitchen now, but even they sensed the heaviness in the air and kept their distance. Ethan looked down again at the small cuts across Clara's fingers, at the redness along her knuckles from endless hours in hot water and chemicals, and a painful realization settled fully into his heart. These hands had carried him through the hardest years of his life long before wealth ever arrived. Clara had believed in him when investors laughed at his ideas. She had worked double shifts while he built software programs through sleepless nights. She had celebrated every tiny victory as though it mattered to the entire world. And somehow, after becoming successful enough to buy almost anything, Ethan had stopped protecting the one thing that truly made his life worth building in the first place. Clara gently pulled one hand free and wiped quickly beneath her eyes, embarrassed by the tears threatening to fall. "I am sorry," she whispered automatically. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "Why are you apologizing?" Clara looked away toward the fog diner windows. "Because this is not who I wanted to become." Ethan's chest tightened painfully. Working yourself to exhaustion for someone you love, seeing someone finally notice her pain, felt almost sacred somehow. Ethan slowly removed his coat and draped it carefully over Clara's shoulders. She looked up at him in surprise. The expensive fabric hung awkwardly over her stained apron, but Ethan did not care. For the first time in years, appearances felt meaningless. "You should go home." Clara whispered softly. Ethan shook his head immediately. Home is wherever you are. The words nearly broke her composure completely. Clara lowered her face for a moment as emotion finally overwhelmed the exhaustion she had been carrying alone for months. Ethan stepped closer without hesitation this time and gently wrapped his arms around her trembling shoulders. Clara resisted for only a second before quietly collapsing against him, exhausted beyond pride now. Ethan held her carefully while the diner felt almost completely silent around them. The billionaire did not care who watched. He did not care about meetings, schedules, or the phone vibrating endlessly inside his pocket. None of it mattered beside the woman standing in his arms after months of suffering quietly beside him unseen. I miss you, Clara whispered weakly against his chest. Ethan closed his eyes tightly. I know. The simplicity of the moment somehow hurt more than anger ever could have. Because there was no screaming, no dramatic betrayal. Only two people who still loved each other deeply standing in the ruins created by emotional distance and neglect. Ethan gently brushed damp hair away from Clara's face before speaking again. Mason's surgery will happen. Clara immediately shook her head. Ethan, please do not think this is about money. I know. His voice remained calm and steady. That is why I am terrified. Clara looked at him quietly then, finally allowing herself to truly see the grief in his eyes. Not guilt over the hospital bills. Grief over lost connection. Over becoming a stranger to the woman who once knew him best. Outside the diner windows, sunrise slowly illuminated the wet city streets while trucks rolled past carrying people toward another ordinary day. But for Ethan Cole, nothing about this morning would ever feel ordinary again. Because somewhere between success and ambition, he had nearly lost the quiet woman who loved him before the world ever knew his name. Ethan took Clara's tired hands one last time and kissed her knuckles gently without shame. Then he looked directly into her exhausted eyes and spoke with the honesty of a man finally stripped of every distraction. I cannot undo the nights you carried this alone, he said softly. But I swear to you, Clara, you will never feel invisible beside me again. Clara stared at him silently while tears finally slipped down her tired face. And in that small roadside diner beneath fading fluorescent lights, the billionaire learned the lesson wealth could never teach him. The strongest people are often the quiet ones who keep loving long after they have started breaking inside.